Hello and welcome to our eOrganic webinar. Today we will be hearing from Drs. Roger Moon and Brad Hines, who will be sharing their research that's looking at some fly control methods. My name is Deb Haliba and I work at the University of Vermont Extension as eOrganic's Dairy Team Coordinator. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with eExtension, and you can find all of our published articles, videos, and upcoming and recorded webinars at eextension.org/organic_production. If you do plan to share the recording or the information presented today with others, we'd greatly appreciate acknowledgement of eOrganic and today's speakers. So before we get started, I wanted to give a quick overview of today's agenda. Our webinar is scheduled to end at 1/4 the hour, and so our speakers will give their presentations for about 50 or so minutes, and then we'll transition over to our question and answer session for the remainder of our time together. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Roger Moon is a professor in the Department of Entomology at the University of Minnesota, where he teaches and conducts research in veterinary entomology, including integrated pest management of arthropods that affect large animals and people, and management options for filth flies on organic dairies and other projects. And we also have Dr. Brad Hines, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Animal Science at the University of Minnesota, focusing on organic dairy production. And Brad has conducted research on cattle genetics and crossbreeding, outwintering, housing options, livestock forages and grazing strategies, and other issues that affect organic dairy operations. And with that, I will turn it over to Roger.
Thank you all for taking the time to log in, and hopefully what we cover in this webinar today will be of use to you. What we're going to do today, I'm going to start off, the lead hitter here, by talking about what we know about different kinds of flies on organic dairy cows, and I will then present results of some experiments we've done with walk-through fly traps, and in turn Brad will take it over and talk about an on-farm study that we ran last year. Just to acknowledge, this research that we're reporting was supported by the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture, under an OREI grant on strategies to improve profitability of organic dairy herds. It's important to know your enemies, and this little table is my way of reminding me to tell you that when you think about flies, they come in different kinds, they come from different places, and they cause different problems. Many of you think of horse flies or maybe biting gnats or black flies or mosquitoes. Those are really all flies, taxonomically, but they come from wetlands, places that you probably can't manage and perhaps might be off the farm in neighboring areas. What we're going to discuss today are a group that we call filth flies, and they're called that because they come from filthy habitats. There are two that we're going to really discuss today. These are face fly and horn fly, and what makes them different from other flies is that they grow up in cow dung pats. I'll explain that a little bit more. Other kinds of flies that are really common around dairies, both organic and conventional, are called stable fly and house fly. These two insects develop in accumulated debris, bedding, soiled feedstuffs, manure piles, those kinds of places. We're not really going to say much about them. We're going to focus again on face fly and horn fly. What makes organic dairies different from conventional dairies is that they often use pasture during the summer, and for that reason horn fly and face fly can be particularly troublesome. Horn flies are the smaller flies that cluster up on the backs of their hosts, and when it's hot they'll swarm down and reside on the lower end, the bellies. Horn fly basically lives on the backs of their hosts as adult flies. Face fly, on the other hand, is a little larger, and it comes to the faces to feed on tears and saliva and those sorts of liquid materials that cattle exude. And these guys come and visit for just a short while. So there's large numbers of them in the surrounding pasture, perched on trees and grass and so forth. And they come for a sip and leave. Horn fly, on the other hand, basically lives on the cattle. Stable flies will also attack on the legs, but again, we're not going to say too much about them. Horn flies bite. They pierce the skin and take blood. about a dozen times a day each. And we know from a substantial number of experiments that if you have a decent number of horn flies, it reduces milk production, and for growing animals, it slows their rate of growth. And a rough sort of rule of thumb is that if you control horn flies somehow, you can increase growth rate and lactation by something on the order of 5% per day. Phase flies, on the other hand, we don't think really affect the animal's milk output or growth rate, but they do seem to be involved in spreading bacteria and some eyeworms. When phase fly appeared in North America, cattle producers started noticing a higher percentage of animals showing up with pink eye, and that's been associated with phase flies. Although pink eye was here before phase flies came, so we know that they're not obligate vectors. But we do think that the phase flies will cause some discomfort to the cattle, and compassion alone will encourage us to try to make our animals more comfortable. Okay, coming back to organic dairies, because of the pasture rule, 120 days dry matter intake limits, those animals are spending time out on pasture, and in turn, they tend to have more horn flies and more phase flies. To understand why, you need to know 2 bits of Flies 101. First off, some language here. This thing on the green thing on the side, the cow was right there a few minutes ago. Imagine that. And a little while later, that muffin dries down and forms what I call a cow pat. But different parts of the country call these things different things. What do you call them? Okay, stay polite. Here's a list of names that I came up with, and you'll understand the fun here. The material is actually called dung. Many dairy people refer to that material as manure, and it occurs in pats, pies, piles, or flops. Dung pats is what I will normally refer to them as. I like meadow muffins. That's one I learned when I was a kid in western Nebraska. In Spanish, bolo fecal, a fecal bolus. And up here in the upper Midwest, we have to be considerate of our Nordic neighbors and ancestors. Dingapat is Swedish, Mokpat is Norwegian, and the one I love the most is Lukevat Kjorset in the Finnish, forgive me for my pronunciation. It refers to sliding mines, which is kind of a sweet little metaphor. Anyway, I'll call them cowpats. And cattle on pasture produce cowpats, and they sit intact for a while. The second thing you need to know is that all flies start life as eggs, they develop as maggots, and then they transform through a pupa and finally form the adult fly. And they don't get any bigger. The size of the fly is determined largely by the kind of fly, and while we see adults, you need to be reminded that they developed as maggots somewhere in the animal's environment. The connection to the pasture rule is that both horn flies and phase flies develop only in dung pats. They don't develop anywhere else. And in turn, if cattle are on pasture, they're leaving more of these intact, and in turn they produce more of them, of both horn flies and phase flies. They lay their eggs within the, or under the fresh dung pats within a couple of hours of when each one is produced, and then the maggots are feeding like whales inside on the particles. 2 weeks later, then the adult flies emerge, more or less. Okay, so for those 2 reasons, the pasture rule worsens the abundance of horn fly and phase flies, and what we're interested in mainly is what we can do to control those 2 insects. But stand back or stay in the truck, and if you watch animals out on pasture, you can tell if they're being bothered by biting flies of any kind if they bunch together. And that's a good indicator of the fact that the animals are at that point in time stressed enough to express their social bunching, and we think it's an innate behavior. It usually happens in the heat of the day. If animals can get into shade, they'll cower there. But if you make the flies go away, they'll spread out. This is a defense against attacking biting flies. So use that as a judge. If your animals are spread out, bedded down, comfortable, not showing signs of bunching or irritation, you really don't need to worry about controlling flies. On the other hand, if they are, then you should also understand that you might be losing money. From an economic standpoint, we don't think that phase fly is affecting the animal's fitness or productivity, and as a matter of an aside, we don't have a really good way to control them anyway, so I'd urge you to ignore phase flies. You'll see them, but there's not much we can do about them. On the other hand, horn fly, I said earlier, we have good evidence that controlling those things increases growth rate and milk output of dairy cattle by about 5%, more or less. And so my bumper sticker advice is to aim for hornfly by the 4th of July in Minnesota and try to get about 2 months of relief for the animals, and in turn, don't give up that 2 months worth of productivity, which would otherwise be lost. Here is some data from actually Brad's Way in western Minnesota in Morris, showing on the vertical axis a measure of abundance of flies on the cows. We do what's called a side count, where we can actually estimate the numbers of horn flies that are present. And you can see averaging across animals. Each little point here is the average of maybe 30 or 40 counts on different cows versus date of year in 4 consecutive years. And you can see generally we see them in late May, their numbers build, they're present through July, and then in August we'll see the populations increase and then finally collapse in September and October. That's a pretty uniform pattern up here, variability from year to year. But basically, if I get you to do something by July 4th, you might be 2 weeks late until we're approaching August, and you can get some sort of control benefits for 2 months there, which is why I say aim for hornfly by the 4th of July. What can you do? Well, first, do a little bit back of the envelope calculations. Brad and I worked these out a while ago, trying to figure out what a 5% increase in milk production would be worth. And these dollar values here are now dollars per day for 100 cows, and the value of that 5% increase in production depends on how productive the cows are to begin with flies, and the summer price of milk. But just bracketing, we think we could see anywhere from 30 to 75 bucks a day for that herd of 100 cows if you could get some level of hornfly control. So use that to judge whether or not it's going to be worth it, one thing or another, whatever you're considering trying. Again, with the pasture rule, we have the practical problem that cattle are out in the pasture, which is a good thing, but it does limit the number of options that organic or pasture-based dairy people can use. Historically, people have used pour-ons or spray-on repellents, and the conventions, it seems generally accepted that these products are very temporary. They need to be reapplied, if not daily, and even then the relief that they produce is not very good. Sticky traps have been advertised, and you can see those in various trade magazines. The problem is that they don't catch hornflies for the simple reason that hornflies stay on the cows. They're not attracted off of the cows to go to sticky traps, so they're really not an option. A device that was invented by a USDA entomologist back in the 1930s is now called a Bruce trap, after W.G. Bruce. And you can see one here in the middle of this low area, surrounded by a fence. This is a walk-through trap. The idea is that the animals would come to water, which would be on your right, come and go through the trap, and in the process, the trap would remove hornflies. And a colleague of mine in Missouri, Rob Hall, and a student, studied these traps and saw that on beef farms with traps installed, they got about 50 to 75% fewer hornflies during the grazing season than on places without. This would be a cow's eye view of one of these traps, or a side view, to get you a feeling for how it works. The animal would walk in, and dangly carpet or fabric inside dislodges the hornflies. So this is a cow's eye view on the left, and on the right-hand side, those flies will naturally, once dislodged, they'll go toward the light, and they work their way through these little funnel-shaped baffles here, and they get stuck in an outer area and then die. That's a good thing from a cow's perspective, I suppose. Anyway, if the cows go through, it removes some of their flies. An obvious question is how many do that get removed, and that's something I'll come to in a minute. These things are practical, and they really work well around dairies. That is, they can be used around dairies because the cows come and go from the milk parlor twice a day. This one is actually set up at the entrance of a dairy that's down in Arkansas, I believe. But the idea is they push the cows through them and in turn remove some of their hornflies. Do that twice a day throughout the summer. Maybe you can keep hornfly numbers lower. That's the idea. You can build these things yourself. I've put my email address here. I'll send you PDFs if you want, or just Google for Bruce trap or walk-through trap, and you'll see designs from University of Missouri, North Dakota State put out a set of designs, and University of Arkansas. And you can build one for about $1,000 in materials plus labor. Question is, how well does it work? An alternative is a device that was invented by Steve Denning and his supervisor, Wes Watson at North Carolina State University. They took this idea, but they noticed that as the animals approached the traps, the Bruce traps, the flies would fly up like they were going over the top, and they were going to come down on the other end and go back on the cattle. So what Steve and Wes did is they added a vacuum system to the idea. So the teal arrow or the blue arrows shows the pathway of the cows going through, and then this red arrow is showing a blower and a sucker on one side, a blower and a sucker on the other in the center. That's the idea is to vacuum flies off. And this idea was patented, tried it initially, and it showed at one research farm in North Carolina and others later that when the vac's on, the fly numbers naturally dropped, which is a good thing from a cow's perspective. This walk-through trap, the vacuum version, is now commercialized. It's sold by Spalding Labs under the name CowVac. And the plan is to install it at the entryway or exit of a dairy parlor or anywhere else where cattle come and go on a regular basis. The one that's on the market needs power at this point, and it costs about $7,500 plus shipping to get it there. Work that we proposed to do a while back was to actually compare the Bruce trap on the one hand with the CowVac on the other. And we ran a series of experiments in 2013 and 2014 to actually measure what percentage of the flies on animals end up getting trapped per passage to give us a feeling for how effective these traps might be. We also proposed to go on farm in 2015, and I'm going to review the results of the experiments research-wise. You won't believe the crazy things that we do. And then Brad will summarize the on-farm studies that we did last year. So we had two research questions, really. What percentages of flies get captured per passage? And those were studies that we did in Morris in 2013 and 14. And then how well do they work on-farm? To reduce hornfly numbers and to prevent losses in milk production? We had 8 farms involved in that one, and I'll leave the details to Brad for that. Crew, you always thank your friends and your helpers. You can see Brad there. It's me on the left, and then students and staff available to help do these experiments. We always have to thank our helpers. Minnesota is unique. It has a relatively large certified organic dairy herd. It's out of Morris. Brad's the manager of it. And what we're doing, we're looking north here on the intake end of the parlor, which is the building off to the right. And at the entryway, we've set up some traps, and it allows us to do experiments to actually calculate how many flies get captured. This is a cow's eye view of that entrance area. And you can see the Bruce trap on the left side and the CowVac on the right side. And we've tried modifying the Bruce trap different ways, and we've tried modifying the CowVac in different ways to see if we can tweak its performance a little bit. The short line on that, answer on that, is that we couldn't improve on the Bruce trap by modifying it in the ways we could think that would be practical, and we also couldn't improve the CowVac by modifying it in ways that would be practical. So I'm really just going to talk about the stock versions, the Bruce trap as described in the designs that I mentioned earlier, and the CowVac as it's sold commercially. Back up here. Imagine yourself as a cow here. You have flies on you, and you would then be directed one way or the other. Okay. In the morning, we could harvest horn flies from the animals by netting them, keep them alive by feeding them blood. If you don't feed them blood, they die quickly. Too bad the cows can't shut it off. Anyway, we divide those flies into 4 groups, dust each one with a special color dust, a fluorescent dust, and then as each of the 4 subgroups came up, we'd let a uniquely marked patch of flies loose onto those animals, and then within a couple of minutes run the animals through the traps routing them with the gates so that a known number of maroon flies, for example, might be on these animals and they're going through the cow vac, and in turn we would capture the flies either being sucked by the cow vac or captured in the baffles on the sides of the Bruce trap, and could calculate how many we released, how many we captured, and from that we get the percentage capture, which is what we're using as a measure of efficacy of the two traps. And this and the next couple of slides are show you the numerical results of what we got. In short, in each case you're going to see the results from the Bruce trap on the left bar and the cow vac on the right bar. The height of the bar indicates what percentage of the released flies ended up getting captured by the corresponding trap. And these error bars are half LSD bars, and don't worry about that what it means. If they don't overlap, that means the bars are significantly different heights, and that's research speak, no more. What you can see is the Bruce trap pulled in about 5%, 4.5% of the marked flies per passage. This is of over 16 passages now. On the other hand, the cow vac brought in about 21% of the marked flies that were on them, which is about 4 times more effective than the Bruce trap. About 4 times more effective. The cow vacs were 4 times more effective than the Bruce traps. We also looked at numbers of, so here are the same results expressed as a percentage in the middle, or just the actual numbers of flies on the left-hand side. And then the other 2 flies that were associated with those cows were face flies, and there weren't very many of them captured. We don't know how many were released. And stable flies, those are the leg biters. We don't know how many were released there. But in both cases, you can see that the cow vac caught more of each kind of fly than the Bruce trap. Okay, so this evidence tells us if you're going to go with one trap or the other, based on efficacy alone, the cow vac is probably going to capture more flies per passage. What it doesn't tell us is whether that's enough to make the animals comfortable, whether it's enough to reduce the numbers of flies on the animals, or whether it's enough to increase productivity, that is, prevent the losses that are caused by hornfly. And so those answers lie in the next study, which at this point is my cue to pass over to Brad.
Thank you, Roger. So based on some of the research that we did here at Morris that Roger had discussed, where we had talked about the Bruce trap and the cow vac, we actually wanted to see how this worked on farms. So we went to 8 cooperating farms in Minnesota. I guess it really was 7 outside organic farms, and then we repeated the research station here that I'm located at was one of the 8. But we had a graduate student along with that, Miranda Kienitz, that worked on this project. And like Roger said, we looked at the cow vac, some of the stuff that he had discussed before. Really, I think that was one of the questions that organic dairy producers were asking us, was how do we control flies? What are their, can we use sprays? Can we look at these fly traps? What is the best way to do that? So we got some of these cow vacs. This is sort of the 1.0 version, the first model that we used here at Morris. And you can see how Roger discussed the cost of those cow vacs before. So really, these were sort of our research questions, I guess, that we wanted to develop and see what we could do. We wanted to calculate catch rates for the cow vacs on farms. So how many flies were we actually capturing by using the cow vac on these farms? And we actually wanted to compare individual fly counts on the cows from when the farm had a cow vac or when they did not have a cow vac. So a graduate student went out and visited these farms once a week for the whole summer and actually counted flies on a fair number of cows on these farms to determine the number of flies on these cows. And she counted horn flies, stable flies, and face flies. And then we wanted to compare the catch rates in the CalVac to individual fly counts to see if fly numbers were reduced. And then we also wanted to look at the production aspect of it. You know, did we see an improvement in production by using the CalVac and reducing the fly population? So like I said, we were on 8 organic dairy farms, and in Minnesota they ranged from 30 cows up to 350 cows. So we had a wide range of herd sizes. There were also many different breeds. You can see the picture there. One of the farms had predominantly Jerseys and Jersey crossbreds, and some of the farms had predominantly Holsteins. So we had 4 CalVacs that we used. We looked at a 16-week period over, and each CalVac spent about 8 weeks on each farm. So there were 4 farms in the beginning of the summer where we placed a CalVac for 8 weeks. In the middle of the summer, we took those 4 CalVacs and then moved them to another 4 organic farms. Here's sort of a little picture of location of the organic farms that we use. So we tried to cover a wide range of the state where we might get some different climate conditions, different temperatures, things like that. So we covered the whole part of the state. Like I said before, we helped the farms set up the CalVacs on their farms. So we delivered these CalVacs in early part of the summer or late spring. We helped them set up their CalVacs, how we would devise so these cows could move through there. And on some of these farms, we even my students even helped push cows through these CalVacs the first time they went through it. Some people might have a question about how long does it take to get these cows used to going through the CalVac, and roughly, you know, after about the second or third time that they go through it, really a majority of them have figured out how to go through it. I think the biggest thing that we saw here at our research station was on first calf heifers. The heifers were a little bit skittish about going through there the first time, but once you get a lead cow to go through, then the other ones just follow, and not much of a problem at all. So every week we cleaned out the CalVacs and collected flies in a little sort of nylon bag that captures the flies. My student there counted individual fly counts on cows, as well as collecting those flies. So we counted the number of flies from the CalVac. You can see the picture there is a big, huge garbage bag of flies. That's what we collected this summer on our 8 organic farms. So we got a lot of flies that might not look like a lot of flies being in a garbage bag, but remember they're quite small, and that's a lot of flies. So we collected all these flies from the CalVacs and tried to estimate how many flies we were capturing with the CalVac. Obviously the CalVac is designed to capture the horn flies. You can see some on the left picture there, the horn flies on the back of these of this cow out on pasture, and you might notice a little bit some stable flies on some of these cows as well that were on pasture. So that was, horn flies was the predominant fly that we were trying to collect on with the use of the CalVac. So this is our arrival day for our CalVacs. You'll notice there's a recommendation that you should clean the filters twice weekly or frequently. I know our student cleaned the filters once a week every time she went out there. And that's probably a good idea to clean the filters off, just to keep the motor running smoothly and not having too many problems. These units come fully manufactured now, so they come on a pallet. You can see it's bolted to the pallet, and that's how they arrive. So it's fully put together. You don't have to put anything together. You just have to unbolt it from the pallet and set it up where you would like it. These here are 220 right now. One of the ones that we had, the 1.0 version, was a 110 version, but these are all 220 now, CalVac. So that might be a consideration for some people where they might actually place the CalVac depending on the power source that they have. So like I said, this is how they come, fully assembled on pallets and actually ready to go and place it where you want it. And some other pictures, obviously, cows walking through the different systems here at Morris. This is when they were walking through the Bruce trap when we were doing the comparison studies, but you can see they're pretty much just following each other right through the fly traps. When going through the CalVac, we've actually set up an extensive sort of a gate system that's able to funnel the cows through at the beginning, and so only one cow can go through the CalVac at a time, which is probably ideal. You notice they walk through kind of a single file, and it's probably good to have it bolted down to a cement pad or bolted to the floor somehow, obviously, or sometimes if you get a few rambunctious cows going through there and it's not bolted to the floor, well, this thing can be quite top heavy and it can just tip over without much work. So bolting it to the floor is probably a good idea. And you can see when they go through there how we've sort of funneled these cows through. We've got a gate on the left and this gate on the right, and they all just funnel through, so one cow goes through the CalVac at a time. So that was our research station. These are some pictures that we had on farms. We actually, out of the 8 farms that we worked with, 2 of the farms were robotic dairies. That was a unique feature that we had these on a robot farm. This is one of the robotic dairies that we used, and we set this up in their sort of grazeway system. They have a Lely robotic system, so we set it up in their grazeway, so when cows came back from pasture, they would go through the grazeway gates and go through the CalVac before they went into the barn to get milked with the robot. So every time the cow came up, they went through the CalVac. On this robotic dairy, the CalVac was running 24 hours a day, really. It was running all the time because cows in a robotic system come and go as they please. So we had to make sure it was running all the time to capture all of the cows. Just another picture of that, how it works sort of in that robotic system where we're just going through one at a time. They've got it set up there in a gate system, and the cows just go through before they go through their grazeway systems. We also had it on another robotic dairy, a larger robotic dairy, and we actually made this one so cows could go through it both ways. The previous photo, the cows only went through it one way as they were going into the robot to get milked, and here they actually would go through it when they went into the barn to get milked, and when they come out to go to the pasture to graze, they would go back through the CalVac there. So this was made so cows could go through it both ways. We sort of modified it a little bit so they were able to get through there, and you can see this farm placed it at the beginning of before the cows could go into the barn where the robot was, and sort of just used some poly wire or poly tape here to funnel the cows in, and they did just fine moving in and out both ways. On the robotic farm, it maybe took a little bit longer to get the cows used to the cow vac because you're not forcing the cows to go through all at one time like you would on a regular dairy, just milking 2 times a day. Just another farm set it up in their cow lane as cows were coming out of pasture. You'll notice we actually used a generator to power some of these. We let the farmers sort of decide what might be the best option to locate their cow vac, and some of these we had generators so we could use the cow vac out in the sort of the middle of the cow lanes or in different places like that. Or if they didn't have 220 that was close by, we used a generator that had 220 power to hook it up. And really there wasn't any problems with running a generator. The cows weren't scared. It was a very quiet generator, so the cows didn't really even notice that. So, and again, our student was out in and amongst the cows all summer, collecting flies and counting flies on those cows. And sort of, you can see she's collecting flies. There's a nylon bag here where the flies are trapped and they can't get out and escape. So once we collect them through the system, they're trapped, and that's what we use to do all our fly counting. So on to a little bit of the results that we had. So these were the farms that we used, all 8 of the farms. You'll notice the milk production. This is in kilograms of milk. So multiply it by 2.2 and you'll get the pounds of milk. But you can see there was quite a bit of variation in some of the farms. Some of these farms fed a lot of supplement to their cows, and some farms were feeding little, if any, grain, so more of a grass fed type herd. So there was a wide range in production levels. And these were the farms are grouped here by whether they had the cow vac first. So these were the farms that had the cow vac during the early part of the summer, and these were the farms that had the cow vac during the late part of the summer. And you can see there's some pretty big variation in fly numbers across the farms, and these are flies per side. So if you wanted to sort of determine the number of horn flies per cow, you would have to double this number. But some farms didn't have as many flies, and some farms had a lot of flies on their cows. And so the same with stable flies. There were some farms that had very few flies per leg on these farms, and some had a lot. And there wasn't a whole lot of difference in face flies across these different farms. You know, most of them were right around 1 to 2 face flies per farm. So these are the results that we saw. So after we put the 8 cow vacs on farms, collected data in the first part of the summer and the last part of the summer, we analyzed to see what would happen as far as fly numbers on cows, whether there was a cow vac present on the farm and whether there was a cow vac that was not on the farm. And you can see when the cow vac was on the farm, we had 11.4 flies, horn flies per side, and when it was not on the farm, we had about 20.5 flies, and that is a big difference. It's statistically significant, how we would say it in the scientific world. So that's a 44% reduction in horn fly numbers by using the cow vac on these farms. So we reduced fly numbers quite significantly. Although stable flies, you know, numerically there might have been a couple less when the cow vac was present per leg. no difference between whether they had the CalVac or not. And face fly, we didn't see any difference for capturing face flies, whether they had a CalVac or whether they did not have a CalVac. So the CalVac was manufactured really to capture horn flies, and it appears that that's what it's doing. We also looked at the growth rate. So this is fly growth rate, and these numbers indicate whether we can sort of reduce the fly numbers, reduce the growth and population of the flies. So if you look at for the summer, the horn fly, when the CalVac was present, we see a negative growth rate. So actually the fly numbers on farms are decreasing when the CalVac is present. So we're able to maybe capture more flies in the CalVac than what are being produced out into pasture. However, when the CalVac was not on farm, we saw a increase in growth population rate of horn flies. So we reduced the growth rate of population growth rate of the horn fly on farms. And stable fly and face fly, there was really no difference. We didn't see any difference in fly population growth rates, whether we had the CalVac or not, for stable fly and face fly. So these are the production figures of these farms when they had the CalVac and when they didn't have the CalVac. You can see there's really no difference in milk production. We did not see an increase in milk production. We did not see a decrease in milk production either, whether they had a CalVac present or absent. Fat and protein per pounds per day, we didn't see any difference in components, whether they had a CalVac or not. And somatic cell count, there was no difference in somatic cell count for all of these farms, whether they had a CalVac or not. So we were hoping to maybe see a benefit in production, but we just did not observe one by using the CalVac on these farms. So we also were looking at the data, trying to see what is going on these farms. And really, there were about 4 of these farms that had what we term no housing. So the cows were out on pasture 100% of the time. They really were out on pasture. They only come up to a building maybe for milking time. And our research station here in Morris is like that. Cows are out on pasture 22, 23 hours a day and only are in a building when they get milked. And then there were 4 farms that had housing. They had basically had freestall barns for cows to come into maybe when it was hot out or raining or different things like that. So we tried to group these farms, whether they had no housing or housing, and actually look at what was going on some of these farms. Now you'll see we have no housing and with the CalVac, and no housing. So these are 100% pasture cows, and when they did not have the CalVac. So we didn't see any difference in production, although it might appear there was a 3-pound increase, but that was not statistically significant an increase in production. However, horn flies, when we did not have the CalVac, we saw about 28 horn flies per side and about 12 per side when we did have the CalVac. So for those farms where cows were on pasture 100% of the time, we were able to reduce fly numbers by 60%, over 60%. So which is a huge reduction in fly numbers. Stable flies, again, and face flies, we didn't see that reduction at all. However, when we looked at the farms that had a, say, freestall barn, whether they had the cow vac or not, we didn't see any advantage in production, nor did we see any advantage in reducing horn fly numbers or stable fly or face fly numbers. So sort of the take-home message is if you have a freestall barn, you know, if it's hot out, cows are obviously manuring, dung pats are going into the freestall barn on concrete or in the stalls, wherever it might be, and they're not being deposited on pasture. So, you know, horn flies are a pasture-based fly, and so when the manure is in the freestall barn, they're not laying the eggs in their freestall barn. So it artificially sort of reduces the fly population if you have a barn. However, if you don't have access to any facilities, maybe a lower input organic producer, kind of like what we have at our research station, you find that it's probably a big benefit to have the cow vac and reducing horn fly numbers on farms. So in the end, basically we saw horn fly numbers on cows, and the horn fly population growth rate was significantly reduced with the use of the cow vac, 44% across all these farms, and greater than 60% when on these farms that had 100% pasture access. However, we didn't see any reduction in face fly or stable fly numbers on individual cows per day when these farms had the cow vac. And like I said before, organic producers that don't have any shelter for their cows or don't have any barns or facilities during the summertime might benefit from having a cow vac on farm to reduce that horn fly numbers. And the benefits of improved milk production with the cow vac were certainly not evident in this study that we observed. So with that, I think Roger and I will be happy to answer any questions that you may have on either of the studies or just in fly control for organic dairy farms. Deb?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Brad and Roger. I'm going to be reading the questions out loud to Brad and Roger, and we'll answer as many as we have time for, okay? And we did get several questions while we were chatting, so I'm just going to dive right in, okay, fellas?
Sounds good.
Okay, first question, how fast do horn flies die without blood?
Half are dead in 2 hours, and the last would die maybe 8 hours later. So that's pretty fast. I can't think of any way to do that on cows and pastures, though, so it's one of those oh my questions that, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. So you might have addressed this already during your talk, but so we know that vacuum traps can control fly problem, but we're curious if they can contribute to stress that could reduce milk production, offsetting gains from fly reduction.
Boy, that's a good question. We didn't test this sort of stress level. We didn't look at the animal behavior of the cows that are going through these different traps. But based on our Rogers and I, you'd probably agree, our experience of working with these cows get used to going through these fly traps quite quickly. Like I said before, within the first few milkings, and they go through it so fast that I'm not sure that there would be any sort of stress going through the fly vacs, but I'm not sure. We didn't look at that.
Right, I would agree. I was thinking quickly, how would I judge whether they were stressed or not? I guess one way would be whether they are reluctant to go through or they gallop away after they've gone through. And I don't think after maybe the second or third passage we saw either one of those. They just leisurely walk through. Sometimes they'd walk in and stand in the breeze of the cow vac, which I think is the other way around. It's not a sign of stress. It's a sign of a relief of stress, maybe, huh? I don't know. It's a good question, though.
Okay, would the timing of the CalVac usage on farm change the numbers? I'm assuming the number of flies. So would the early use cut the population to lower levels later on in the season when the CalVac is not used? And conversely, would a late usage have an expected carryover for the next year of flies?
Yeah, Brad, let me take that one.
Okay.
You'll notice in Brad's numbers, we were talking about average numbers during the period when the trap was present or absent. That was the first way to look at it. The second way we looked at it was whether the numbers changed. And it's a bit technical here, but think of it as the population is naturally growing in spring. And our question was, if you had a CalVac there in spring, could you reduce the rate at which it was growing? And the answer is yes. And it slowed down the growth rate or kept them low. When we removed the CalVac, then the growth rates came back up naturally, and that's driven by the weather and all of that. And if you put a CalVac in the second half of the season, the population would naturally be growing, but we can slow it down. And so what we found is we changed the growth rate of the populations by putting a CalVac in place. We didn't look at fly numbers the following year, but it's possible, remotely possible, that if you really hammered the hornfly population in fall, you would have fewer the following spring. But our work in population dynamics of these insects suggests that it's really the weather in spring that's going to drive the numbers. It's not how many overwinter, because very few of the flies actually survive the winter to begin with. So I don't think there would be much of a carryover effect. On the other hand, I think it's the benefits are when the CalVac's in place. And if you've got one or have one to put in place, I would recommend that you run it all fly season long, just for the simple reason that you reduce the numbers for the whole season. Does that answer your question?
Hope so.
Brad?
Yeah, I think you hit it just right, Roger.
Okay, this fellow says, I see a few hornflies in the barn when an organic producer uses a bruise trap. Do you see any hornflies in the barns when using a CalVac?
Yeah, you're probably going to find hornflies on cows after they've gone through the CalVac. It's not 100% perfect. It doesn't suck every single hornfly off of there. And I think, we had showed our data before where we can collect about 25% every time the cows go through there. So I think you're still going to see hornflies on cows, say in the barn or in the milking parlor, obviously at a reduced number, but they're probably still going to be there.
I'm just going to move back to the previous question. Someone had a follow-up question. If the flies are dying during the winter, the hornflies, where are they emerging from in the spring?
Good question. And I neglected to say that about how all these different flies overwinter. The answer is with hornfly, come fall, the maggots turn into pupae under the dung pats that they grew up in, but they enter a condition we call diapause. It's the equivalent to bears hibernating. They slow down, actually stop developing, and they spend the whole winter under their dung pats as pupae. That's where hornflies overwinter. Then the following spring, as the weather warms, then their development finishes and they emerge as adults. So usually when the weather's 50 Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius, shortly after that, if you look carefully, you can see the few overwintered hornflies actually starting the population the following spring. Often we don't recognize them until much later, but it's because you have to look really hard to see the few that are there. So that's where hornflies overwinter. Phaseflies overwinter as adults in buildings, and we're not sure where houseflies and stable flies overwinter. I think it's around semi-heated barns, but that's a reason for argument among our colleagues.
Okay, thank you. I have two related questions about sort of economics and economics of the CalVac and milk production. So one, I'm just going to read them both. So the first one says, if there is no discernible improvement in cow production, how to justify the payment of a CalVac at $7,500. Okay, that's one. And then the second one says, you say no significant increase in milk production, but isn't the economic threshold for hornflies around 100 per animal. None of the eight experiment farms were near that. Can you hypothesize about milk production increase on a farm that is starting with a lot more, say 200 flies per animal? I know that's a mouthful, but maybe address economics of, putting one of these units on your farm.
Well, I think I would address the second question first. I know, I think Roger and I had discussed that. We were sort of in 2015 where we did this study. We just noticed there weren't as many horn flies on cows here, at least on these Minnesota dairies, like we had seen before. It was a little bit cooler this summer, in July, and it was 50 degrees out, and in the early part of the summer it was really cool, so it wasn't as hot as possible. So we think that the horn fly numbers probably weren't as high as what they might have been in some of the other years. So yeah, we did show the data there from farms, and there is maybe not as many flies on cows as what you might expect there to be. I know we've seen probably more flies on cows than what I sort of visually observed here in Morris last year. Then, the first question poses to the economics, and I think it sort of plays along with the fly numbers as well. Sort of pose a good question about the economic threshold of 100 horn flies, and if we would have seen more flies on cows, would have we seen maybe a response in milk production? And quite possibly we could have. We're just not sure. I think that's part of the study. We noticed we had lower horn fly numbers, but we didn't see a difference in milk production. And I think sort of a side note, Roger had another graduate student look at behavior of cows, where we actually collected behavioral measurements on cows that were out on pasture, tail flicks, head flicks, all kinds of different fly defensive behaviors. And there we didn't notice any difference in production, whether they had more flies on the cows or not there either. And that study was conducted here at our research station. So, it would be nice to have another year or so of the data just to take out weather conditions for this study. Roger, any comments on that?
Sure, I can add a couple of them. First off, depending on where you are, the horn fly quote economic threshold differs, and it's very confusing. I've tried to pull together the literature, the experimental studies. Almost all of them are based on beef cattle, and they're based on weaning weights of calves coming from farms that received or didn't receive horn fly control. I'm not sure that 50 per side or 100 per cow, and toward the south it's 200 per cow. I'm not sure those thresholds are really defensible based on the experiments that we've seen, but that's okay. To leave that as an aside, the question really is, will the amount of benefit depend on how many flies you have in the absence of control? And so far it's not clear that that's the case. The other thought I was going to add is that we look for relationships between numbers of flies on the animals and their corresponding productivity among the farms, and there was a weak one there, but it's not really a bell ringer. A third thought, and you sort of touched on that, Brad, is that how could you justify this? We did, that other student's thesis that you mentioned showed that the numbers of behaviors were related to the numbers of horn flies. That is, the more horn flies, the more irritated, however you measured it, the cattle seemed to be. And I think I could say, forget economics, maybe a reason to try to improve the animal's comfort, or maybe that's a goal. Not necessarily expect to get it back in the milk tank, but get it back in the increased comfort level that you create by partially controlling the flies. The last thought is, I think we're trying to measure something that's just innately quite variable. And from farm to farm, trying to predict that you're going to be the average farm is going to be very difficult. Our experiment was limited to one summer and 8 farms, or 16 half seasons, and I think we're trying to measure something that's just generally pretty variable to begin with. But if you look at your numbers, Brad, there are trends, if you will, of increased productivity with lower hornfly numbers, especially in that last slide, with and without housing.
Correct.
Not significant, but still it's there. And I think if you're driven by compassion or a gambler, maybe that would justify the purchase. But if you're a strict accountant, I don't think you could do it based on our results yet.
Okay, I'm going to move on to other types of research that may or may not have been done. So, do you know if there has been any recent research done on the buffalo flytrap out of Australia?
To my knowledge, the company that was selling that thing has gone out of business. I haven't seen or heard anybody talk about it in almost a decade. So I have not seen any recent studies. If somebody has seen one, send me the link so I can check it out. I'm unaware of that one.
Okay. How about this one? Are you aware of any research that's been performed looking at enhancing different bird or bat habitats and their ability to decrease fly counts on cattle?
I love that. I've had this discussion with several people just in the last month. To answer the question, no. It's a difficult study to do. That is, you're actually going to change bat or bird numbers on different farms and then measure a change in fly numbers. That would be very expensive, and like trying to measure changes in milk productivity. There's so much variation from farm to farm, it's hard to measure small effects. On the other hand, my position is you're probably not doing any harm by improving habitat for birds or bats. We'll leave rabies aside with the bats, but if you feel better because you've done something to try to improve the bird and bat population on your premise, I don't think you're doing any harm, and more power to you. So to answer the question, I'm not aware of any work that would demonstrate benefits, but again, my understanding of nature is that the harm isn't going to be there, so go for it.
Great. Can you comment on the effectiveness of fly destroyers or other fly parasites?
Okay. This goes back to my Flies 101, that there's different kinds of flies. They grow up in different places. And to my knowledge, nobody has shown that releasing beneficial insects of any kind controls horn flies or face flies out in pastures. These beneficial insects either eat maggots, or they are little parasitic insects that sting and lay eggs and develop at the expense of fly pupae. Okay. On the other hand, there's a mix of evidence for the effectiveness of those things around the farmyards directly, where stable fly and housefly are developing. So it's important to know your enemies and who you're shooting at. And if you're trying to control horn flies, I'm not aware of any research that's shown that those beneficial insects will control horn flies any better or worse than a Calvac or repellents or any of the other devices that people use.
Okay, these questions kind of relate to like breaking up the manure pad. Okay, so I wonder if the population of dung beetles in manure pads, breaking them down quicker, excuse me, and making the breeding spots less available would make a difference. What do you think?
It has in Australia. They have 2 flies in Australia that are kind of equivalent to our pasture flies. They have a buffalo fly, which is a close cousin to our horn fly, and they have a bush fly, which is a relative to our face fly. They both develop in cowpats down there, and the Australians had a 20-year project importing African dung beetles into Australia to try to create, try to control those flies, among other things. And they showed on a regional basis that where they had more dung beetles active in the dung pats, they had fewer of those flies. My experience in Minnesota, and it's going to be different for the folks that are in the southwest or the southeast, where the soils are sandier and the rainfall is greater during the summer and the winters are shorter. My experience in Minnesota is that we rarely see enough beetles to actually disrupt dung pats to the point where I think they could even begin to be affecting those flies. I've seen meadowlarks or other kinds of birds in California go through and just peck the bejesus out of dung pats, spread them out into small fragments. We did a study with packing cattle tightly to try to trample the dung pats and measure effects on fly control, and we couldn't show it. Fact is that these maggots can develop in gobs of dung the size of a golf ball. So you've really got to break them up into really tiny pieces if you're going to stand a chance of controlling flies that way. Going through once a week, that's nowhere near fast enough. You'd have to do it daily, and you'd have to really flail chop everything. And I just don't think that's good for pasture or practical from a diesel standpoint.
What about a flock of chickens at the appropriate stocking density following herds?
Yep. That has not been studied in the field. There's 2 papers where Canadian researchers parked Muscovy ducks around calf pens and showed that they ate flies, but they didn't really show that there were fewer flies with and without Muscovy ducks. So nobody's looked at following grazing cattle. My sense is that chickens are generalists. They feed on a bunch of different things. They're probably more interested in the grain in the dung than they are in the maggots that are developing in it. But if you imagine my picture of my dung pats, the fresh one and the old one, I say it takes 2 weeks, but in reality the maggots in there for about 3 or 4 days. So the chickens would have to be hammering the pretty fresh ones, and I don't think they like dung on their beaks. I don't think they work the really fresh pats fast enough to really control the flies. I'm speculating here. We need research.
Okay. So we talked about chickens. We talked about dragging and disturbing the cow pats. How about pasture rotation or paddock rotation?
Another way to ask that question is, how far will a newly emerged fly fly? Mm-hmm. How far would you, if you could basically hide from them by moving the cattle away from where the flies are growing up? These flies can travel a half a mile easily. And so on most farms, you've got small pastures and the animals in rotation. It's trivial distance for these flies to emerge in an old pasture and find the cows in the new one. And unless you're just really hammering the dung pats by packing the cattle tight, I'm skeptical that you'd be able to control them by trampling. So I don't know that we tried to study that and we couldn't show benefits of that. We got to the point where I think we were actually encouraging the weeds by busting up the turf, and we backed off from that. Decided we can't get enough control by packing the cattle tightly.
Although Roger, remember we sort of as a side note, when we looked at a study where we looked at grain supplementation levels of cows, we did notice a reduction in horn fly numbers. I believe so, whether on cows that were on 100% grass with no grain versus compared to cows that were supplemented.
No, that's interesting.
That might be an option.
So feeding grain reduced flies?
Yes.
Actually, for face fly, it went the other way. Feeding grain made for more and bigger flies.
Right, yeah, feeding grain made more and bigger flies.
Any experience with bedded pack? We've heard stories about flies occurring less frequently when cows live on or have access to bedded pack.
Well, yeah, we did the study here in Morris where we looked at bedded pack production of flies, and we can produce a lot of flies on a sort of a bedded pack with straw. And a lot of it was pretty much stable flies. We can grow a lot of stable flies if you let the sort of bedded pack sit there and bake in the summertime. And we also compared it to wood shavings, so kind of a compost barn. And we didn't see many flies coming out of the compost barn. So when there's sort of a straw sort of in the mix, probably the best thing to do is to clean up your straw right away, or clean up the bedded pack and get it out on the fields, and get rid of it, and you'll reduce the fly numbers.
Great. Can you talk about the relationship between flies and mastitis?
I have a colleague at North Carolina State who would be the best person to answer that question. There is an association between hornfly numbers, biting around the teats, and bacteria on those flies. And it's conceivable that flies are picking up the bacteria and spreading them from animal to animal. It's also conceivable that infections are possible, enhanced a little bit by the biting of the flies directly. But I'd point out that there are lots of herds that have mastitis in the middle of the winter when hornflies are not active. And so there's got to be more to it than mastitis. If you look in the textbooks, and I'm not sure the flies read the textbooks, but there is an association between summer fly numbers and mastitis infection rates. But that's an area where we need a lot more research. It's not really clear to me. Again, I can't see that controlling hornflies would worsen the mastitis problem, so trying probably won't do any harm. Whether it'll do much good is the other issue.
Right.
Well, we have a few more questions in the queue, but I see that we're out of time. So perhaps I will hopefully pose those to our two speakers, and maybe we can get back to you on those. But I want to thank everybody for your questions. And as I mentioned before, this webinar is part of an ongoing series at eOrganic. And you can find an archive of today's session, the recordings of our other webinars, and articles, videos, and more at eextension.org/organic_production. Thank you so much for joining us, Roger and Brad, and thank you all for coming today.